The office of Speaker of the House is a peculiarly American institution, one that doesn't really have a direct analog anywhere else in the world. A lot of people, when they first hear the presidential order of succession, they find it strange that the House Speaker is right at the top of the list after the President and the Vice President, since here in the 21st century, the Speaker often isn't one of the most prominent players on the stage of national politics. But when you think about how our government was conceived by the men who conceived it, it makes total sense why the occupant of that office should be that high up on that list. In fact, you can learn a lot about the original conception of our national government by looking at the presidential succession list. The Speaker of the House comes directly after the Vice President because he, or she, is the head of the House of the People's Representatives. Remember, the Senate isn't popularly elected and doesn't become popularly elected until we get to the horrendous, god-awful, terrible, horrid 17th Amendment a little over 100 years ago. So as an administrative matter, your three main organs of government are the executive branch, represented by the president, and the two houses of the legislative branch, one of which contains the people's elected representatives, and the other of which, the Senate, contains the designated representatives of the state governments as elected by their legislatures. And so the president pro tempore of the Senate is next on the succession list after the Speaker of the House, because that's the order of precedence that the founders settled on. The presidency will devolve first onto the designated heir from within the executive branch, who's also president of the Senate, then to the chief of the people's representatives, then to the chief of the state's representatives. And obviously, since the vice president is also president of the Senate, that's why you have to also have a president pro tempore. Otherwise, you've got the same guy or woman in the number 1 and the number 3 spots on the succession list, and you can't have that. Up until the first half of the 20th century, it would have made perfect sense to every American that the House Speaker and the President pro tempore of the Senate should be the top figures on the succession list, because up until then, so far as the domestic political landscape goes, the President and the House and the Senate were seen as roughly co-equal figures with similar levels of power over the course of events, as they were supposed to be. But for the last 90 years now, since the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, domestic political power has been draining away from the legislative branch and toward the executive branch, to the point where now, when the president thinks a thing should be done and Congress doesn't want to do the thing, he just tells them to fuck off and does it anyway by executive order. And that's the sort of thing that would have been inconceivable up until fairly recently, because that's not how our form of government was set up. It was set up with guardrails and checks and balances. But guardrails and checks and balances don't work all that well unless the people who are supposed to be abiding by them actually do that. But our presidents have failed in this department, and both houses of Congress and the judiciary have done not nearly enough to forestall it. But I digress. The office of House Speaker is probably as close as our form of government gets to the British parliamentary model, since it's an example where a member of the legislative branch also wields some form of executive power. Indeed, in some cases, absolute autocratic power, because one of the most bizarre features of our government, at least, again, from our perspective here in the 21st century, is that the House Speaker is, to all intents and purposes, the monarch of the capital city. Don't be fooled by the fact that there's a person called Mayor of Washington, D.C., and a group of people called the Washington, D.C. City Council, because that mayor and that council, they wield no power except that which the Speaker of the House chooses to delegate to them. A delegation that the Speaker can revoke at any time of his or her choosing. Which is to say, there is a new absolute autocratic ruler of Washington, D.C. today, whom we can now officially address as Speaker Mike Johnson, currently in his 4th term from the 4th District of Louisiana. Most people hadn't heard of Mike Johnson until yesterday, at least not this particular Mike Johnson, because let's face it, everybody in America probably knows a guy named Mike Johnson. It's probably the most blandly American name there is, and that's just fine. But if you're a regular viewer of this program, you already know this man's name, because I called attention to what I thought was his very fine performance against Homeland Security Secretary, enemy saboteur, and skin-suited reptilian space alien Alejandro Mayorkas in a committee hearing earlier this year, a clip that has now gone viral, and for pretty good reason. Mike Johnson is clearly a very sharp guy, a very well-spoken guy, a guy who's willing to publicly call out a scumbag criminal who is smugly lying right to his face. And I hope he keeps that up in his new role, because let's face it, he's going to sink or swim just like all Republican House speakers do, according to how effectively he deals with an openly, venomously hostile fake news media that advocates for the other party and doesn't pretend otherwise. Kevin McCarthy, I thought, did unexpectedly well at that aspect of the job. He didn't suffer very many foolish bullshit questions. He would tell a reporter exactly why their premise was complete nonsense. And this whole thing worked out pretty surprisingly well for Matt Gaetz, who he decided to push all his chips to the middle of the table and put his political future pretty much on the line to oust McCarthy and hope that somehow, some way, when the music stopped, they'd wind up with somebody who was an upgrade. And it looks like that's exactly what happened. Jim Jordan didn't make it. He would have been an upgrade too, obviously. I'm not heartbroken that he didn't get it, because I think he's doing great work in his committees, and becoming the speaker might have only blunted his effectiveness. But it looks like this thing came down, as these things often do, to a personality contest, because even the squishy liberal Republicans voted for Mike Johnson, who is, by pretty much any standard, more conservative than Jim Jordan is. So obviously there's no objective political standard at work here. It may just be, it probably is, that Jordan just has enemies in the conference and Johnson doesn't. But in any event, our short national nightmare is over. The People's House is back open for business, and they can get back down to the very important work of spending your money like drunken sailors on a 48-hour shore leave. Oh, and you'll be shocked to learn that the Democrats and the fake news media, but I repeat myself, say that Mike Johnson is a dangerous, radical, right-wing, MAGA, extremist, insurrectionist, election denier who wants to unplug your grandma's life support and make your daughter get a back alley abortion. No, of course we didn't write these monologues 2 weeks ago, and we just been waiting around to see whose name we need to copy-paste in there. We'd never do something like that. We are intrepid professional journalists around here. How dare you? From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where I have begun wearing these in the car just because I enjoy the strange looks from passing motorists. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I'm your eponymous host and humble servant. And in the last 6 or 7 weeks or so, I want to be upfront about this. I have given Canada a pretty hard time. I've talked about driving through Vancouver and seeing junkies shooting up on the street for 10 blocks in a row. I've talked about unfortunate encounters with desecrated war memorials. I've talked about their blackface Prime Minister Trudeau, accidentally giving a standing ovation to the fucking Nazis. Also, I'm not naming any names here, but I am gratified that several prominent conservative podcasters have stolen that joke from me. I'm happy to help, fellas. But tonight I am here to make amends for all that, and hopefully to begin to make things right. Because tonight I want to call attention to one of the most glorious days in Canadian military history, the Battle of the Chateauguay. And I can't wait to see what the YouTube caption engine does with that one, which took place exactly 210 years ago today, 26 October 1813. And yes, if you pronounced it in the technically correct original French manner, it would sound more like Chateauguay, which I think is what Ricky Martin calls his steam room. But I have it on good authority that the correct pronunciation for English speakers is Chateauguay. Which, look, if I'm being honest, it's not really all that much better than the other thing, but there's something strangely fitting, I think, in the idea that one of Canada's greatest feats of arms should take place on a field called Chateauguay. But I don't want to put up too mocking of a tone here. I don't want to make light of the fact that this thing was a glorified skirmish with fewer than 4,000 total combatants and combined losses of 25 killed, 49 wounded. Because do you know what title, what proverbial battle streamer Canada earned on that day that no other nation can claim ownership of? And they've earned it twice. It's the battle streamer that says, America tried to conquer us, and they failed. The first time Americans tried to conquer Canada, it was back during our revolution. Benedict Arnold was the commander. before he did his big pro wrestler heel turn and hit George Washington with a folding chair. And the strategic thinking was, look, it's only been, less than 20 years since the French bugged out of Quebec and told all the Quebecers, we're out of here, good luck being British subjects now. And the Quebecers still aren't sure how they feel about all that. There's a hell of a lot of anti-British sentiment among those Quebecers, is all I'm saying. So let's just say we try and make a spearhead thrust right through Upper Canada into Lower Canada. And yes, if you're wondering, it's a peculiar quirk of the geography of the period that Upper Canada is south of Lower Canada. And we take fucking Montreal. And all the Montrealians, Montrealites? They're all like, yeah, we don't like those British much none neither. And boom, Bob's your uncle. We conquer the place. We turn all those Frenchies into goddamn Yankee Doodle dandies. Was it a good plan? No, it was not. Does an already outnumbered force have anything to gain by detaching a part of itself to attempt capturing an objective it can never hope to effectively garrison, even if it succeeds in taking it? No, it does not. In a war with no shortage of strategic blunders on the American side, in which, let's face it, we got our ass bailed out in the end by the generosity of King Louis XVI, the abortive, shambolic attempted invasion of Quebec is probably the mother of all blunders. But for some weird reason that this reporter is powerless to explain, the idea of conquering Canada didn't die with the end of the Revolution. 30 years goes by. There are still lots of people alive, even in those days, who remember the Revolution perfectly well, just as we today, many of us, remember 1993. And along comes the War of 1812, which is a very strange little war, which nobody in Europe really remembers. In Europe, 1812 is the year Napoleon marched on Moscow. Even the British don't remember there was a war going on in North America, even though they were one of the belligerents. And for us in the United States, it's a very minor historical footnote at best. It's probably best known for being, 1, the war that inspired the writing of our national anthem, and 2, for being the war where we won our greatest victory, the Battle of New Orleans, 2 weeks after they signed the peace treaty. But General Andrew Jackson didn't mind all that much. It made him a man of national renown, and he rode that notoriety all the way to the White House. Still must have been kind of a weird feeling, though. You're a coach and you think you've won the Super Bowl, and a month after the game, you find out you scored the game-winning touchdown after time expired. Sorry, coach. Turns out it was a tie. These things happen. But for as much as Europeans neither know nor care that there was a war on this continent in the early 1810s, and if they do, they view it as a minor sort of offshoot theater of the larger Napoleonic Wars, which it pretty much was. And for as much as Americans know about it but mostly don't care, for Canadians, on the other hand, the War of 1812 is a big damn deal. In fact, it's viewed by a lot of people up there as sort of the crucible in which the idea of a Canadian national identity was forged. And if you've ever had a Canadian friend, you don't need me to tell you any of this, for you know all too well that whenever a Yank and a Canuck get into a nationalistic shit-talking contest, and this is a documented law of nature, by the way, either the first or second thing the Canadian will always say is, yeah? Well, we burned down your White House, eh? And it's true. They did. Can't take it away from them. Scoreboard don't lie. And what event was it that filled Canadians with such a seething bloodlust that it impelled them to march all the way the hell down to Washington and set all the buildings alight and send James and Dolly Madison fleeing for the Virginia foothills? Well, it was our second failed attempt at conquering Canada, the one that met its ignominious end on the field of Chateauguay on 26 October 1813. Now, when this war kicks off, and ostensibly the casus belli on the American side was the impressment of U.S. citizens into the Royal Navy, but that's all very complicated and frankly not important now. There's a feeling in some quarters, despite what a disastrous failure the invasion of Canada had been back during the Revolution, that invading and conquering Canada is still a good idea for the United States. And the reasons for making the attempt weren't all that much different in 1813 than they had been 30 years before. We are at war with the British. They use Canada as a staging ground for their land forces, but they still have this big, largely disaffected, not entirely loyal French-speaking population in which we might be able to foment rebellion if we were able to make an effective thrust up toward Montreal. But we'll take a different route this time. We'll go up the St. Lawrence, approach from the east, instead of going overland from the west. It's going to work out great, guys. You'll see. But if history teaches us anything, it's that when you try to externally foment rebellion for short-term political or strategic aims, it often winds up having the opposite of the desired effect, and sometimes in ways that you never even considered or imagined. So not only did the second attempted U.S. conquest of Canada fail just as shambolically as the first one had, but this one had the unintended side effect of galvanizing, for the first time ever, Anglophone Canadians and Francophone Canadians into something resembling a common notion of Canadian identity and nationhood. Because there is nothing that unites disparate groups of people more quickly and effectively than a shared grievance against a common enemy. Nothing cuts through ethnic animus faster than that. So all of a sudden you got people in Upper Canada and Lower Canada alike. They look at each other and say, you know, we haven't gotten along with each other all that well over the years, but I think we can all agree that we don't like those bastard Yanks coming up here trying to conquer us every 30 years. So what say we set our differences aside, march down to their capital, and set their president's fucking house on fire, eh? And I think that for a good long time into the future, Canada will still be the sole owner of that battle streamer that says we successfully repulsed Yankee annexation. And for a long time, they were also the only owner of the battle streamer that says we burned down Washington, D.C. Right up until BLM and Antifa both earned one in 2020. Thanks, I'll be here all week. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen, for watching. Have a great day and a pleasant tomorrow. See you Sunday for the Blast Radius, 8 Eastern, 5 Pacific. Do not comply. Get off my lawn!